Hi, and welcome to the Next Step devCon podcast. I'm Shreyang, head of developers community for reactCon, a React Native event taking place at Next Step devCon Berlin. So, from October 7 to 9, this conference will witness world's largest gathering of mobile developer at one place. Today, I'm here with Anisha Malde, program committee member of reactCon. Anisha is a senior developer advocate working at Amazon. Anisha, hi, and welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks, Shrikant, for having me. So, I'm Anisha. I'm a senior developer advocate at Amazon, and my role so far has been focusing on bringing React Native to Amazon devices. So, it's basically my job to make it easier for all the React Native devs to build using React Native for Amazon devices, which include Alexa, Fire TV, Fire tablets, and recently I've also been doing Ring, which is not React Native, but all the devices span across our team.
So at Amazon, you're building for TV, Alexa, Echo Show, and Fire tablets through Vega OS, all using React Native, right? And of course, developing for so many devices could be challenging. I'm just curious to know, right? What are the common problems which keep showing up, no matter which platform developers are working on?
Sure. Yeah, great question. So I think like Echo Show and Fire TV use Vega OS, but we also have Fire OS, which is running on our TVs and tablets, which is Android. So React Native is like powering two different operating systems, allowing us to build for our devices. So it's not really like one problem, but it's like building for all of them and the tension of building for all of them at once. Because you're not just dealing with multiple platforms, right? We're dealing with multiple operating systems, device fragmentation. And each of these devices also has different user inputs. Like how you would interact with your Echo Show is very different to how you'd interact with your Fire TV. But the thing is, users expect that same experience across all of them. And we want to write code once, but each device has its own quirks. A phone might have 4 GB of RAM and, many gigahertz processor, but a Fire Stick's like 1 GB of RAM and like much less processing power. So even if we want to write the same React Native code, we have very different resources like at our hands. And so what might run smoothly on your phone might struggle on a Fire Stick. And I think then you compound that with like what I said, like about input methods on different services, touch on tablets, D-pad on remote, voice on Alexa. That same component that you're building in React Native might behave very differently depending on how the user interacts with it. And then all of this kind of falls apart at scale because you've got performance, state management, tooling, testing, CI, and all of that when you multiply it by the different platforms is what makes it really difficult. But I think the best thing is that for us, like solving for TV made our development approach like easier across the board because like when I like to say that building for TV is like doing everything on hard mode. It makes it easier, but I think the main tension is for all the different form factors we have to build with.
Sounds like there is not just one problem. It's completely different user experience on each device screen, right? So
Yes.
while talking to React Native developers, I found that most of them, when they start building an application, they think only about building for platforms like iOS and Android, right? And going beyond mobile becomes a task for the future. So I just wanted to know, why should a React Native developer care about going beyond mobile and build for multi-platform? And what's at stake if they design their app without thinking about multi-platforms from day one?
Yeah, so great question. And I think what I like the platforms that React Native supports right now are constantly growing. Like, we're not just building for mobile. We've got TV, VR, tablet, desktop. And I like to think that it's not a matter of when you're going to start building for multi-platform, but if. And for example, if you're building a streaming app today, you might need TV support, but we've already had to extend like the same apps to TV, tablet, Echo Show. And some of that, might have been planned if you're building your app and some might not be. Like it's just kind of the ecosystem that we are in right now with React Native. And I think it's the beauty, but also like the difficulty of how you architect your app. So you have to make those decisions around like navigation, state management, and like how you design your components early Otherwise, they're going to be like very expensive to undo later on. Because code that was designed for multiple form factors might become, like a spaghetti code if you force it onto a new screen without thinking about that new form factor early on. And I think that like if you're thinking about building like with platform agnostic like logic from day one, that makes it a lot cheaper to like have the cost of like developing for like different platforms later. And I like to like think about, I said this during my talk I did at app.js, where good enough, like if we build good enough, that definitely breaks at scale. So if you have like, for example, a CI/CD platform that works fine for one platform, if you multiply that by six different, even just thinking about TV, like you've got Apple TV, Android TV, Fire TV, uh, everything that you're building for one platform might fall apart at scale. And so you have to think about those things like testing strategies, performance benchmarks before you hit scale. So that's my saying, like build for scale before you hit scale.
Yeah. And definitely the screens always multiply whether you planned for it or not, right?
Yeah.
Now, whenever a React Native developer starts building for multiple platforms, they start to encounter a lot of challenges, right? So, what do you think are the most frustrating mistakes or misconceptions you see developers make when they first try to share code across multiple platforms?
Yeah. I mean, that's like the it's like famous Shakespeare quote. I like to redo it. Is like, is it to share or not to share? And that's the dilemma that we're always in. And I think the biggest mistake like I see is assuming that like what you build for mobile will just translate, because there's no like tap, swipe, scroll like on a TV. Like TV is D-pad. There's no touch like or mouse. It's just like one way movement. And so sorry, four directional movement. But and I think that's not the only thing. Like things like lists, for example, one package might work great on your phone. So like flat list or flash list might work great on the phone, but when you're scaling that to like thousands of items in the list, there might be other options that are better. And that's kind of what you have to think about, like what should I share and where to not share, and like what is that abstraction balance. And you kind of have to think about whether you're going to either under or over abstract in a way. So I like to make sure that your platform logic is in your is abstracted is abstracted away, and making sure that like what matters for each native platform is what you think about. And I think performance is the biggest one, where you have to consider like what you share and not share. Because I'll give you one example, like just a simple library. When we use like that list library on a phone, it might perform very different to how it might be on a TV. And while that might be a library or component that you can share, it might be something that you might think about when it comes to performance and is it worth sharing or not. So I think you have to like take every kind of aspect and think about it like from the very beginning. And I think one of the other things that like we tend to see is what to test on. And I like to think about like the minimal viable device, like when it comes to that. So if you're covering the range of devices you're targeting, so for example, if you've got like 10 TVs, pick like the minimal viable device in that category and test for those like for the things that matter for your app on that. So agree on the metrics that you want to test on, like whether it's time to first frame, and then test it on the minimal viable device, and then see based on that performance like what might make sense to share and not share. So it's kind of like it's a long process, but when you figure out what works for your platforms, I think it makes it much more scalable.
Interesting. So you mentioned that open source is your best friend for multi-platform development in React Native. So for a developer who is trying to scale their app right across mobile, TV, and web, then evaluating third-party libraries can be sometimes tricky. So what's your advice on navigating the open source ecosystem, And what should a React Native developer do when a crucial library simply doesn't support one of their target platforms?
Yeah, and I mean that's a good point. Like I mean most popular libraries currently only support, iOS and Android. But the React Native website has a really good filter where you can actually check which library is supported on your platform. So there's a filter for Fire TV, Fire OS, Vega OS, Mac OS, React Native for Mac OS, and I think that's the best place to start. And if you are going to go down the route of adopting the library for your platform, make sure you check everything does work before you decide to use it. And then if you do have to abstract, think about the cost of doing that. So it's not about whether it just works as well, right? You kind of have to think about everything that comes with that library as well. Does it affect your bundle size? Does it affect the performance of how the library works on your device? Then if you're going to abstract it, is there going to be a maintenance burden? Are you going to have to keep checking for different platform quirks? So I think you have to think about each library a lot more when you're building for multiple platforms than just taking what might work on one and adapting it to the rest. So again, I wrote an article about this specifically, comparing two very common libraries. So it's date-fns and moment.js. And the reason I was doing this was quite funny. I was I implemented both, and the bundle size for each one was really different on TV. And I was well, this is a simple library. What's causing such a big difference? Because there are tools obviously to see how a library would affect your bundle size. There's called Bundle Phobia. Expo has another one, which again, because we have to think about everything you're putting on in your app for constrained devices. I was doing it, and weirdly enough, though, even though Moment was meant to be the lighter library, when I put it on in a TV app, it wasn't, and that's because it's not just the library. It wasn't but when you're putting it on a TV app with React Native tvOS, it wasn't stripping out all the things that you didn't need, so everything was getting imported. So I think again with multi-platform, every decision you make kind of has a cost, and when a library doesn't support your platform, you have to think about first the options, then the cost of the options, and then if there is no option, do you want to fork it? Do you want to wrap it up, wrap it for your platform, or do you want to just build your own? And I think the benefit though is that the community has done a lot of work around this. React Native tvOS is the main project used for extending React Native for TV, and there are a lot of community solutions. So I would say before you adopt a library, make sure it works for your platform, check the cost of it, and then if you do need to extend it, think about the cost of doing that, and make sure you contribute things back. And I think that's what I'd like to do, is make sure that if I'm using something and contributing back where I can, if it's something that the community can use.
Yeah, I mean, the main objective of open source is to help others always. So if somebody is
Yeah.
using it, then of course, one should always contribute back to the community. And looking at what you said, it's more it's less about reinventing the wheel and knowing more about where the wheels already exist first, and then moving on to placing them in the right place, right?
Yes, definitely.
Now, when you build for TV, tablet, and Alexa simultaneously in React Native, how do you decide what logic stays in the shared code base versus what gets split out for each platform? Is there any framework do you follow, or there is a rule of thumb do you use?
So I think my rule of thumb would be if the behavior is the same, if it's meant to behave the same. For example, you're going to navigate the same way, but it just looks different, then you can share it and just style it differently. But if the behavior is fundamentally different, for example, if you've got a tablet and you've got a tab navigation system versus on your TV you've got a menu bar on the left hand side, that's not just looking different, like that is a fundamentally different like logic of how your navigation behaves, and that's where you would split it. Most of the time I found that like business logic is usually the same, like your API calls, your data processing, your state management, and that's what usually like forms the core of like what we share. And then when it comes to like components, like you just have to think about like what are the platform specific like adaptations that I need. Is it just layout? Is it spacing? Is it just the font sizes that differ? Or is it like that there's fundamentally different input methods? And that's something that we always have to think about, like, touch on tablet, D-pad for TV, voice on Alexa. And for that, there's no getting around it. But there's many solutions, like, you can have, you can use the platform API, or you can have like platform specific extensions that React Native will then, pick which one is the best one to use for your platform. So I think like with our platform specific like extensions, we would make sure that it's anything you put in there is things that definitely can't be shared. And then I think testing is another really good example of like what you can share or not share. And I think the logic is something that's always easy to share, but then say, you had your different input methods, just abstract those out. So you're not like maintaining an insane testing suite for what is essentially the same test, but just like different input methods. Because if the assertion's the same, the setup's the same, and the only thing is the input that changes, that's what you need to then just abstract away, and then you can like scale that approach for whatever you're doing. And then I think with Vega OS as well, like we have tooling that makes this easier. So we have something called the Vega module resolution package, which takes, if for example, like if you were using Reanimated from React Native Reanimated in your code base, but we have our own specific version of Amazon Devices Reanimated. What Vega VMRP does is it replaces what the package for the React Native, like the community package, with the Amazon specific package without you having to do anything. So I think we have tools that make this problem a little bit easier, but making sure that your business logic is already shared and your UI adapts is what I would make sure I do if I'm like thinking about the problem.
Yeah. Anisha, you have been in Amazon for a while working on multi-platform apps, right? So what's the hardest lesson you have learned building for multiple Amazon platforms that a React Native developers won't find in any documentation? Maybe you can tell us something about what developers only discover when something breaks in their code.
Oh, interesting. So I think like this is kind of like we did this talk again, like it was called the bigger picture, and it's like all the lessons that like I learned from building at scale, which I think is maybe a nice one to think about. And one of them was like your library choices. So like all your libraries have that hidden cost, which I've already touched on, but I feel like this is something that no documentation really tells you, and you only discover it when you're picking your libraries. And I think with every code base, like you're not maybe starting it from scratch. Like you might inherit something that already has made a library choice, and it's very rare that you would be like deliberating or like thinking about each library choice critically. But with those low end devices, like every kilobyte you're putting into your bundle makes a big difference. So thinking about the hidden costs of libraries is one that I'm really passionate about. And then the second one, again, like what I spoke about how good enough will break at scale. So whenever you're starting to think about multi-platform, you need to think about scale before you hit scale. And I think that's the main one that we always try and do no matter what we're building is, will it scale? And not just the app, but like your pipelines, your testing strategy, and making sure that you are shifting everything to like as much as you can do locally without having to put the pressure on like your pipelines is another thing that we try and do to make sure that everything is running as efficiently as possible. And then I think maybe another one would be like thinking about the navigation, like, or the flow of your app before you start building for different platforms really makes it easier. So if you're thinking about like how your app should look on a phone versus a TV versus a tablet, that doesn't just help like how you're going to build it. It also helps about how you think about like the flow of your app, because it's not just like what you see, it's not just the layout, it's also like the flow and like focus paths and visual focus states. And I think when you're thinking about all of that from the get-go, you're building a much better user experience than if you just thought about like what it should look like. So I think, yeah, like that's kind of what like building for TV first has taught me about building for like the different platforms at scale. And I think that really helps when taking some of those like lessons that maybe you wouldn't think about if you're just building for like one platform, makes it easier.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting to know a lot of things about multi-platform code base for React Native developers. And thanks for answering all of them, Anisha. So my next question is a bit community based, right? So
Sure.
very soon, as a program committee member of reactCon, you will be reviewing CFPs from the React Native community. So
Yeah.
if we keep our podcast topic aside, what topics would you like to see in those CFPs that would genuinely help developers attending the conference?
Yeah, I mean, well, I might be a bit biased, but I would like to see about how AI can enable the cross-platform story. I feel like we're no longer like none of us are building for one single platform anymore. I think like and most people like, even if you're just building with React Native, right, you are building for iOS and Android. So I would like to think about like how AI makes that journey easier. And maybe it's not just about like what like your framework, it's also like how can you build like agnostic code. And the next app con has multiple streams. Like we've got the AI stream, we've got the React Native stream, we've got the Android, I think, as well, right? Is there Flutter?
Yeah.
Yes. So I
Yes,
think like it's
Flutter.
building even. I would like to think about like how do you also build like framework agnostically, and is there tooling that's going to shape the way we build or test or ship for these different platforms, regardless of what OS they're running. And I think those are some really interesting conversations that I would like to speak about and see and hear. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot to talk about when it comes to what would you expect in CFP from the community, right? It's a long list, of course, and it always keeps
Definitely.
on changing with time. And hopefully that, yes, AI is really hot right now, and hopefully community knows because it's a hype, but as well as, for developers, AI is a very useful thing as well. If you use it wisely, it's a very good tool for you, but
Yeah.
people are very skeptical about how to use it efficiently, what makes it more efficient, because every day AI is changing and we don't know like what will happen after 6 months, right?
Of course, yeah, and
Yeah,
I think
so
there's so much tooling like at we've got on our fingertips, and but what is the best way to use that tooling? Like you're only as good as like how you know how to use your tools, and I think that's what I also am trying to like learn every day, and I would love to see like how the community is doing that.
yeah, definitely. So I hope community is listening to this podcast and reactcon gets the best submissions that make sense for the community today. So it's been a wonderful conversation so far, Anisha, and it's time to move on to our next segment of the podcast, which is Would You Rather Rapid Fire Round. It's a fun segment and I like it the most. So I will give you some impossible choices to make without thinking too much. You just have to pick one, okay? Yeah. So would you rather maintain one messy shared code base for all platforms or maintain separate clean code base for each platform?
Ooh, definitely one messy shared code base, because I feel like you can refactor messy code, but like trying to reconcile like 6 different code bases that have shifted the way they're building is really hard. And I think messy is a bit more fixable, but like fragmentation is a big nightmare.
Would you rather have perfect performance on TV with no mobile optimization, or decent performance everywhere with no platform being great?
Well, I think that's a trick question because if you've got decent everywhere, including TV, you've already thought about like all the constraints that TV has, like, you know, the lower end devices, the different like form factors, and I think that will make it easier to build for everywhere. So it's like, I think that TV is hard mode, and so if you've got it decent even on TV, like you've got it decent everywhere in a way.
Yeah. Would you rather debug a D-pad focus management bug on TV or a voice input edge case on Alexa?
Oh, definitely Deepak because like at least I can see like what's going on, and I think with Alexa Plus sometimes as well, like because it's using like AI to give you the answers, um, I might not know like what the answer is going to be. I'm much more of a visual person. Like I would take a visual bug any day.
Okay. Would you rather React Native officially support all platforms out of the box with no community libraries needed, or keep the current ecosystem where community drives the platform support?
Definitely the community ecosystem. Like we wouldn't even have um, React Native or TV as a thing without the community. And I think like official support from big companies sounds great until you realize like how much it might slow things down. And there's never like a one size fits all solution. I think the community keeps us honest. It keeps us moving, building faster, and like building for like what developers actually need. So I would always go community first.
Would you rather learn multi-platform by breaking production on real device or through guided documentation and sandbox projects?
Can I say breaking in a sandbox where like on a real device? I don't think I would ever want to bake anything on production here at Amazon. I think I don't know if I would have my job the next week. But I always recommend like always test on a real device. Like it is basically your production environment. Like I have like 3 Fire Sticks for the different operating systems. So one that's running big OS, one that's running fast, and I make sure that no matter what I do, I test it on like real device before shipping anything out.
Yeah, that's why these are the impossible questions.
Yeah.
So, would you rather test your app on 50 real devices or rely on emulators and simulators for all the platforms?
Well, I would rather, like me personally, I would rather test on an emulator because I have so many devices and I have like a whole drawer and I don't want to plug them in. But like I said, you should always be testing on real devices because the emulators don't have like the same, memory constraints, the same like firmware, I don't know, quirks. Like for example, DRM doesn't work on our emulator. You can only do it on the Fire Stick itself. And I think you need real hardware to catch those like real problems, and that was the whole point about like picking your minimal viable device. So I always pick like the lowest memory Fire Stick for when I'm testing something. So if it works there, then it's likely going to work on like my real TV. So I would always pick real devices. But if I had a choice, there would be great emulators that worked exactly the same as my real device. Because I live in London, I don't have enough space for all the devices that I have to test on.
Yeah. So, yeah, that was fun. So, thank you so much, Anisha, for sharing insights on focusing on shared code base and building for multiple platforms. I'm sure those were really eye opening for anyone thinking beyond just mobile. So, for everyone listening, if you are a React Native developer who has worked on something interesting lately and want to share it with the community, our call for paper is now open. You should definitely submit a talk. The link to submit CFP is on our website. And don't forget the dates for reactCon Berlin, it's October 7 to 9. Thank you everyone for watching, and thanks Anisha for joining us in this podcast. Bye bye.
Thanks for having me, and I definitely hope to see all of you submitting your CFPs soon. Can't wait to read them.